Well, good morning. Welcome to class. Those of us around me, this is day 3 for us of the class here at Corning, and we're doing blown work, hollow work at the torch. So we're working with a lot of tubing. These folks have been pulling a lot of points and things for the last few days. We're doing blown shapes. The blown shapes I usually make take the form of ornaments. So I'm going to go ahead and demo some ornaments now that I usually do. We have been building up to introducing some color too in our work. This is the time we're going to take that step. I start in my work with standard wall tubing, which is a little lighter than is common, I suppose. I'm kind of accustomed to it. I cut my teeth in this work in scientific glass, and that's more common in that world. So this is sort of my comfort zone. What I'm doing now, I need to seal a holder onto the center here, and there's no surface there for me to connect to right now. So I'm just going to soften the tip of this tube, get it malleable so I have something to connect with. Set a holder in place there. Broaden out my fire a bit. And I'll pull my first point. The angles I'm working at are all about distributing the heat. I want an area of tubing wider than the flame itself to be heated so that I'm sure I have enough glass. As I stretch this point, I'm thinning the glass out. So I need to start by thickening it up first. That's about the length I want. That'll go in my rack. And while that's cooling, I'll pull some cane out. I stand up when I pull points. I sit down when I pull cane. I can't explain why, it's just my comfort. Usually doing it the way that puts you in a comfortable posture is a good idea. For whatever reason, it works. I don't pull my cane in very long sections at a time. And I don't pull them that awfully thin. Because as I apply them to the clear tube, which is coming up, I like to be able to lean on them a little bit. I'll be applying it with my right hand to tubing held in my left hand, and it steadies my hand if I'm able to lean on the left with my right. A couple more of those to do. You know what? These are too long. I'm going to go this way. I put these clear handles on earlier thinking I'd need them, but I think I overthought it. You'll notice when you start melting color that it's real evident your evenness of your rotation. If you create hot and cold spots with color, it really shows a lot more than it does on clear. Well, color in general glows brighter, and so I guess that's part of the reason why. So now this first point that I pulled is cool. I'm going to cut it open. This is one of the things with pulling points. It's why it's critical that you build up enough glass first You don't want to thin the point out. If you do, when you cut it, it's apt to crush, and you'll have to be pulling pieces of it out of your thumb, which still happens to me occasionally. Right now, actually this one went pretty well. I usually assume that I pulled this point almost, but not quite straight. So I take a minute just to make sure that it's on axis with the tube itself, while I still have that whole tube as a reference. I'm moving around on the tube a little bit to cover more area, but it's critical that I don't move in a sweeping pattern while I'm rotating. That would tend to create a spiral pattern of heat, and that would not serve me well. I'm pulling this one longer than I did the previous one, because it's actually 2 points or handles. The second handle for this one and the first handle for the next one. Now I had prepped this one earlier, so this point is ready to hold already. Now when I pulled this point, I referenced it to the tube itself, so I have a baseline. Now, before I continue, I'm going to make sure this is in line with the rest of the blank as I think of it. It's actually pretty good. Having a good morning so far. When it's important and I'm trying to decide how straight the thing is, I like to look at a compound angle down like this. I have the feeling it gives me a better view. So the design I'm going to do has color in sections, but not all the way through top to bottom. So that I have an indicator where to begin and end the application of color, I'm going to section the tube into 3 parts. What I'm doing now is just heating a narrow band. As the tube softens, I'm going to stretch it to really thin it out. And then that thin area is going to be very responsive to the flame. It'll start to collapse, and as it does, I'll squeeze in a little bit, forming kind of an abrupt groove. It would work well to have some sort of an edged marver to roll it in to create that groove too. But I never got around to getting one. And you can see it's not, it would be efficient, I suppose, but it isn't necessary. That's one possible problem. Another concern is the way I'm doing it, because of how I'm doing it, I'm less likely to miss and create a spiral. If you roll it against something, you better roll it straight, you know, things could go bad. There's step 1 of this design. This is actually step 1 of a lot of different designs, but hot glass doesn't stick to cold glass, so I have to warm up the substrate a little bit, but not an awful lot. So there are some fine points of applying color. One of them is you want to be able to separate the rod and not have a mess on the end of it. So put some criteria on how you terminate the stripe you've laid on. And the way you do that, you're actually heating a couple of millimeters ahead of where you're laying it on. And so to get a nice clean separation, just come out of the fire a second before you come off. That way you've used up all the glass you melted These are going on relatively cold, and I don't want them to crack, so I'll keep going back, melting the ends in. If it does crack, the crack's almost certainly going to start on the end. The worst part is where you start and stop. So I take a little bit of time and make sure they're sweat in good. We were talking earlier about my torch at home has a little bit of a knob on the side of it. It's for adjusting the pitch of the torch, but it works out to be a good hand rest for the left hand. And so I'm doing my best to find a similar spot on this Carlisle CC. One more. Gee whiz, I don't know, I don't keep track. Because they vary a lot. Like I usually don't use them all up. I'll finish so many ornaments and then wherever I am, that goes back in my file and I start something else, so I really don't keep track. I do use them all the way up though. When it gets too short, I seal a clear handle on and use it all the way up. There we go. So now I've got all the color on there. I'm going to reheat that whole area, get it up in that malleable range and twist. But as we've been saying, and I've been reminding you guys all week, when you're doing hollowware, you have to keep track of which end is open. So I'm going to reverse it for that reason. This is the end that's open, and I'll be blowing from this side. You can create a twist a lot of ways. What I find works for me is I continue rotating the same direction with both hands. I'll just increase the rate of rotation with my left hand. After each step, you kind of have to rotate and maintain that axis before you move on to the next step while it stabilizes. Now where I created kind of creases or ridges earlier, I'm going to exaggerate that melt and really pull them down into some more extreme valleys this time. Almost like like an hourglass, but it's going to get stretched out longer than that. So. The glass is getting smaller in that area, but it isn't getting thinner. It's actually getting thicker right now. Again, I do that in preparation for stretching, which will again thin it back out again. The idea is to end up with a thick enough wall after you're done with whatever element of the design you're working on. Now I've reversed sides, so this end is closed, but I'm hoping I won't have to blow in it anyway for this stage. So. You'll notice I'm by no means continuously rotating in one direction. I go back and forth all the time. Should be comfortable moving in both directions, because ultimately we're applying heat evenly and compensating for gravity when we're up in that flow range. Neither one of those things necessitates continuous rotation in one direction. There are things that do, but this isn't one of them. Most of my designs, I guess that's increasingly not true, but traditionally most of my designs are symmetric top to bottom, and that the symmetry itself tends to be the hard part. That can be difficult to match one side to the other. Okay, now I am going to blow that center up, so I do have to switch hands. Again, I'm working with angles to spread out the heat of the fire, but I've also now got a situation where I'm working with a relatively big hot fire right next to areas that I drew down pretty small. So I'm angling the fire away from those areas on both sides. I don't want to melt those. Also, at this point, you have to be conscious of your rotation. You don't want to, I could conceivably, if I wasn't careful, untwist the twist I put in.
You ever put color in the where your flame is now?
Yes, in fact, I'm gonna. After I do this element. This is called a Mariah. It gets called both. And sorry, I don't know the origins of the term. I think I mentioned I learned originally as a scientific glass blower, and in scientific glass, this has an application, this little feature that would be like a sidearm on a condenser that would keep your rubber hose from sliding back off again. Here comes that color. I'm gonna go all the way around that with cobalt blue beads. Here again, there are tricks to having a steady hand. Notice my right hand's not floating in space. I'm actually leaning on the ornament to stabilize it. I have a better grip on the ornament with my left hand than I do with my right, and I am right-handed. The greater variety of things that you do and the more difficult things that you do are done with your dominant hand. Your non-dominant hand is tasked with supporting and rotating the glass. And so you do need and you do have a better grip with that hand. My right hand is underneath, and that will, well, I suppose I blew the center up, so that must have already been evident. But the reason for the underhand posture is so that my hand's not in the way of my mouth when I come around to blow. I'm just doing a little preliminary shaping since I'm here on this side. I'm gonna stop and come back to it though. I want to match what I've done with that Mariah and the blue beads on the other side. It's easier to stay symmetric if you go back and forth with each step. If I build this whole side, switch it around, it's harder to match. I might have to blow now, so I'm going to switch around. This is one of the reasons I like to work with points. They're flexible. You can kind of go back and forth as to which is your open or closed end. Heating a narrow band and squeezing. And start squeezing right away as soon as you feel the glass soften. Don't melt it much first. You run the risk of having it collapse down and close then. I guess it was a good thing that I opened this end and closed the other because I want to prep this side to match the other. Okay, now I'm ready to put the color out. I call this design a spires, and now I'm ready to put the color down on the spires. The spires part of the spires. I need a little more horsepower. In the body of the ornament, I just crowded as many cobalt blue stripes as I could fit. Out on the spires, I'm going to put 8 stripes. It's one of the easier increments because you're splitting it in half and in half again and so forth. It's harder to visualize the relationship if you put stripes on in 3s or something, then you've got a 120-degree relationship. That's a little harder to picture. So. One, two, three.
Where in the flame you're putting the color rod?
I'm working generally just in this zone, a ½ inch or less or so off of that inner cone. That's kind of your general working zone, and in this case, that's about where I am. And most of the flame is going on the color. A little bit on the clear substrate, but not much. It's a thin substrate. It wouldn't tolerate a lot. Now I've just cranked up the gas. I want a little bit larger fire. I don't need a real hot fire, but I do want a bigger fire. I'm starting to stretch now. part of the change in shape you see is coming from the glass collapsing because it's so hot. The rest is coming from this stretch that I'm imposing. And it didn't go real well, so I'm just going to fix up the axis a little bit before I move on. Since I twist the color into a spiral in the central body, I keep it straight on the outsides. It's just the contrast looks nice, I think. Now I've created sort of a wide spot here. I'm going to heat right along that and squeeze to exaggerate it a little further. Now, I'll put a color bead out on the end of each one of those. I'm sorry, again? Oh yeah, right, yeah. I already have my marks made because I'm matching the lines, and I'm affecting less area, so it kind of matters less. When I'm doing the full line, if I put a line on one side and then just continue working around, I feel like I have a hot spot and a lot of cold area. And I also, there's only so much that goes into setting the spacing, and you can end up with an awkward gap. If I'm off, I split the problem in half by the way I do it. When we start getting more involved in colors, realize they're stiffer. That is to say, they don't melt and flow as readily, for the most part, as the clear glass does. And so it can be that you feel like you stuck a blue bead on there and you're satisfied it on, but when you really look close, still kind of coldly sealed. Worth going back and making sure. It shouldn't matter, but I'm still kind of keeping track of which end is open in case I do need to blow. There's a delicate balance at this point because I kind of need to work here. I need to have the substrate hot, but if I get it too hot with all this unsupported leverage, it's not hard to guess what's going to happen, right? The ornament's going to bend over, which to some degree may happen. I'll survive. It's looking like I drew out just about exactly the right amount of rod as I'm going to need. What luck for me. I hadn't given it a lot of thought in advance. So I explained before, I do this, I go back to make sure those ends are sweat in. In this case, I also go back to straightening it because it is bending a little bit as I do that. Now, I want to draw these out straight rather than twisting, as I say. But if you look close, you may find they twist. I want them to end up straight. They might not necessarily be straight throughout the whole process. Remember I said before how I was resting my hand? That part's hot now, so I've got to reach out a little farther. This is the part in the process when I decide which is the top and which is the bottom. I think that's the top. Now it's also the part of the process where I cut, whichever end is closed, I cut it open. I've got both ends open now. Yeah, you know, it doesn't matter as it turns out on this one, it wouldn't have made any difference. Most of the time it does. It'll matter on the next one. I'll explain that issue then. Generally, well, I can go into it now. Generally, I would, rather than add rod to make the loop, I would just collapse the tube down into solid mass and make the loop. But I don't want a blue loop, so I'm pull that material away in this case. To make a loop, again, you're going to stretch, which means you have to make sure there's enough glass involved so you don't make it too thin. And gravity shouldn't be involved, so if it's flopping around trying to flow, you're too hot. If you want it in a malleable state so it's just responding to the force you apply to it. Make sure that's touching there. I generally make loops a little larger than I want and a little thinner than I want. And then I'll just heat the whole thing and let it gather in on itself until it shrinks and thickens up. There's only one part of this process that you won't get to see here. This is the part where I would have a little steel bar on my bench with my logo engraved in it, and I would press it in the base of the loop right there. But there's only one of those, and I'm terrified of taking it out of my shop. So lest I lose it, that would be bad. So if you find any of my work that doesn't have my logo pressed in the base of the loop, it was either made as a gift for friends or family, or it was made as a demo here at Corning and contributed to the auction they do for tuition help and so on. So that's a louder, bigger fire, but it's actually colder than anything I've worked with yet. It's a gentle heat. What I'm doing right now is in preparation for closing off the ornament. This design is going to have no weep hole at all. It'll be sealed up. But before I do that, it's important that I drive any moisture out. I can't just melt it and pull it away. I've got to increment it so that I have control and it doesn't blow out on its own once it seals up. So there's the first one. In a little bit, when it's cool enough, I'll hold the ornament itself, pull off this temporary handle, and hang it on my brass ring there. Meanwhile, I've got a board. Gee, thanks. So let me prep the next tube. I can cut this open. And again, I'll reference this tube, make sure it's on axis, this point, make sure it's on axis with the tube itself while I have that opportunity. Notice when I have the heat I need, I come out, I'm not in a hurry to pull, let it stabilize a little bit. Now I'll take this one that I prepped earlier. Want to be cold? I was confident it was cold, but I'm wrong sometimes, so it's good to tap it a couple times, make sure it's not hot. Okay, pulling points is about the only thing I do standing up. Done with that. I'm going to rest this one here. Well, the board's a better place. I'm done with that for now. I've got some cane prep to do for this next design. I'm going to do this one in teal and white. This might not actually be teal. It might be aqua or something like that. I forget. No, I have pretty good luck with it, and it's behaving itself now. Pulling this a little longer because I almost ran out of cane on that last one. Lucked out. But again, pulling them longer means melting more glass to begin with. Don't just pull it longer. You'll end up with something that's too thin to be stable. Even here, it matters how you separate, because you can end up with stringy messes on the end there before you even get started. I'll hold it up here. As I stretch it out, if I've got thicker spots, I'll just hold them, because the whole thing is so hot anyway. If the thick spot is just in proximity of the fire more than anything else, you can stretch it a little more. Ideally, though, you get all the heat you want in there to stretch it before you really start stretching it. To kind of continue to heat and pull more tends to, well, it certainly gives me a choppy, uneven result. I know some glass artists, especially jewelry people, they'll heat a spot and just keep pulling. They'll keep the heat just on the shoulder, and they'll continually pull a consistent diameter out of it. I'm impressed. Scientific glassblowers never need to do that, and that's where I learned, so I never got good at that. So I kind of work around it. But I'm impressed. Oh, well, look what we can do now. This ought to be cold enough. I used to put these handles on in the form of a punty, but sometimes they break prematurely, and other times when they do break off, even when you want them to, they take a little divot out of the loop, which you have to patch back in, and it just seemed easier to just... So I seal the holder on good, so that I have good structure, but I have a really small contact point. And so that strikes the balance. It's still no big fuss to take it off. Can't quite hang it there yet, though, because the loop is hot. So. One of the things as we work with tubing more, you're looking kind of through the material, and it starts to matter what's on the bench in front of you. So it's a good idea to keep distractions out of that zone. And I'm going to check which end is open. Now this time I don't have to do that task of sectioning off the tube into 3 areas. This one has continuous color from top to bottom. But it has a kind of a flat crown at the top, which I'm sort of pre-forming now. And a similar smaller one at the bottom. And you're right, I'm not able to blow in that end. I think it's going to be okay. I think I can just squeeze and get what I want. Yeah, that's good enough. Now, there's one thing I do on this that I often don't have the opportunity to do on other designs. This gets crowded with color. I've got 2 different colors. There'll be 8 stripes of each for a total of 16, which is just about what fits around this circumference of this tube. So one of the things that means is that the spacing is a little more critical. For that reason, well, I still get to put the first stripe on without worrying about it. It matters after that. Some colors are stiff, so much so that as I do this technique, you see I'm only heating one side of the glass. A really stiff color will seize up on you because the back side is relatively cold. You're only heating one side of it. To compensate for that, I twist it. I rotate this glass as I'm dragging it along, and that kind of helps prevent that cold area in the back. So the design It's critical in spacing, but it gives me the opportunity for this line of sight, which helps me see where I need to be better. And the spacing only matters on the first color. After you get all 8 of those on, the second color goes in the only space that's left. Okay. I don't do that, so I can't relate directly. Right, it's you know, rotating this way as you're pulling it this way. I can't take credit for really planning and controlling this, but I'll point out it's working out really well for me. This point is like just the right length. Look, I can rest it on the bench to stabilize it. So now the spacing is getting a little easier to see. I'm sorry, with the blue?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one color, so my plan there in the center body, I just crowded in.
Yeah.
Now I did do one side and then the other side. I split it side to side, but then I just crowded however many fit. I put them real close to each other. If I put them real close to each other and I've split it in half to begin with, I find I won't be too far off. But I don't bother counting them, I just crowd them. Here the count matters because you got to get the same amount of both on. Yeah. One more of these. I hope that's 8, right? Was anybody counting? Yeah, that must be 8. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I'll fill in every other void and then go back and fill the rest of them in, rather than going continuously from one point like I am. It's probably a good idea, but I do it sometimes and I don't do it other times, and it hasn't seemed to matter, so. it can tend to create a crease that can be hard to melt out. And if you don't melt it out, it can lead to a crack, yeah. It's not a good thing. And sometimes you can melt it out, but by the time you do, you've kind of lost the aesthetic, you know?
If you were to error on the placement of the color and it were to go a little too short or a little too long on the tube, which would you recommend?
So you can get in there, we've talked about microsurgery, a real hot, real aggressive, and then that wipe-off technique, get the waste really hot and then just wipe it away. That would be my approach to get rid of that excess color, to try to erase it the best I could.
So too long better than too short, because it's harder to add.
Too short, you can add, but I wouldn't trust myself just to add. I'd probably start at the top and lay another whole stripe over it. It would be a smoother result. And then, since I'd have kind of an imperfect spot, when I twist, I'd really twist. That helps hide it. Notice when I'm reheating the thing to keep it warm, I'm covering a lot of area with a small fire, but I'm not, I'm going to a spot and then another spot. I'm resisting the temptation to do this, like we talked about, to avoid that spiral heat pattern. When I pull my cane, I was saying I want to be able to lean on the ornament itself to stabilize my hand. I also want it stout enough that it isn't flexing when I'm pulling it down through. One more. There, the hard part of that one's done. Now remember that the inner fire will affect the character of the outer fire, and I had a pretty aggressive inner fire. I don't need that anymore, so I'm backing that off. Now we'll introduce the outer fire. And right now, as is my habit, it looks like I'm just getting ready to twist, but I'm really making sure I didn't miss any spots as I go around. Yep, I'm covered. Because this is my last opportunity to fill in a void if I left one. Once you twist, it's too late. Again, just twisting faster in the same direction with my left hand than I am with my right. The tube will kind of get this spiral crease in it as I twist. That's why the reason for that puff of air that blows those creases out and gets me back to a nice cylinder. You see me stop rotating at points, and for 3 days I've been telling you, keep rotating, don't stop. What I'm doing, I've basically got to gather here. And if it was off center, I stop to let it sag back to axis. Now I'm kind of reinforcing that flat crown effect at the top of this design that I started initially. And here again, I'm getting it really hot and it's really loose. So it's important to control your rotation so you don't untwist the twist that you've got. I wanted sort of a conical transition up towards the top, and it was bulged a little, so I heated a section and actually sucked in on it. You can do that under the right circumstances. It's important that this end be closed, though. If the glass is hot, this is open, and I suck in, then I draw that hot air down my lungs and get hurt. As long as this end's closed, you're fine. I'm basically doing the same thing at the bottom as I did at the top. I'm just doing it longer. You guys were looking at some of the designs I brought with me that are squished flat flanges like, and we were talking about, somebody asked, and yes, the answer was they start out as a sphere, which is what I'm doing here. Blown the sphere, and now I heat sort of around the equator, if you will, of that sphere creates the weak link. So when I squeeze, there's the result. Now I put clear beads all around this flange. And I may be overkilling it, but I like to do it now while I know I have good heat all through that flange. I could reheat it later, it isn't thick, but this can't be a bad idea, so I go with it. Putting clear beads on this time. I only use color beads rarely. When the whole ornament is one color, that's one of the times. For the most part, I like clear beads. And if I'm putting clear over an ornament of a couple of colors like this, it's nice. I don't have to worry about lining up the bead with the color. I can just put them on. And it's a good idea to crowd as many as you can on anyway. It adds surface area. The more surface area you have, the better they sparkle in the light. So. It's also important that what you use for, I try to avoid any colors that are stiff, that don't like to melt and flow well for beads, because they can be problematic. Beads need to really flow in, and you don't, it's just a bead. How hard do you want to have to work at it to get it to flow in? Now after that, I just want to check my alignment, make sure I'm good there, and keep rotating until it stabilizes. This is another one of those Mariahs like I did on the blue ornament, on the spire. That was the other design. This design is called a finesse. I don't have any hot ornament involved now. It's just the handle and it's cold, so I'm back to being able to rest my hand against there. Now, at this point, I'm preparing the top for where the loop will go, and I want that flat area up at the top. So all of this that is now flaring out from there, I want to collapse that down pretty abruptly. So it's going to take a lot of heat over a small area of what is already thin glass. I am stretching out. Because you stretch, that makes it start to collapse more aggressively, but it wants to, as it's melting, it wants to gather in on itself. So you kind of squeeze in a little bit to let it, to make sure you're not interrupting with that natural sort of effect. And there, see what I mean? Took some of that taper out.
So stretch, then push.
Stretch, let it start to collapse in the fire, and as it's collapsing, push back in. In fact, if you overheat it and it's collapsing too aggressively, like you're afraid it's going to close, squeeze in more aggressively. It's like you jam it up and it puts the brake. You can prevent it from collapsing if you jam it in a little more abruptly. I don't quite like the shape of this crown yet, so I'm going to suck in on it again, and you just saw me glance over to double check and make sure that end was closed. Better.
So that just increase the angle a little bit?
Yeah, it draws the lower side down a little more abruptly, a little more dramatically. The caution here, not to get too much of this rod hot. It can get a little hard to control. You want to pretty much heat the amount that the bead is going to be. Deposit all that glass on, pull away, and start again. It's almost like dipping a brush in paint. You know, somebody was talking about brushes before and paint brushes, but anyways. Good. Missed the spot. Now, I want to take this down a little farther. I'm not ready to start forming the loop yet. I've got work to do on what will be the bottom of the ornament still. But while I'm here and it's hot, I want to work it a little more. And in doing that, I knocked my alignment off a little bit, so let me fix that. Bless you. Here I'm heating and squeezing to build up weight because I'm going to stretch and re-thin it out to a more slender tip. That's where I'll tip the ornament off at the bottom then. So that side of it's prepped. Heat that largest point, that edge, and squeeze to exaggerate it a little bit. And we'll add more clear beads. Now I'm getting ready to make the loop. This time it does matter that I cut both ends off. It gets really floppy and unstable because you've got two such thin rods there at the base of the loop. So one of the things you can do to maintain control is angle it down a little. That way gravity's not pulling so counter to your direction. And again, all of that was just about making sure I've driven out any moisture so I don't trap it in there. And there's that one. And this one, shucks. This one can hang on the brass ring now. Where? I have no idea what time it is. Do we have time for another? Have we got another? Okay, I guess I've spent my time. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for watching.